Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I'm really happy how the last video where I was discussing Ukrainian summer campaign has been received. I think the message really landed with no misunderstanding, which is a very important thing for me. And I'm going to tackle some of the comments you made later in the video. But right now, let's jump into the front line and I'll tell you where Ukraine has certain successes because there are some. The situation here is very tough. There are fighting that is happening along the main defense line of Russians. Ukrainians are using parts of this defense line to have established positions and fend off Russian counterattacks. Russian attacks from the flanks have been trying to be resumed with a little bit of a, I wouldn't call it a success because they gained one place, but then they lost some other places, which is on the, I guess, Ukrainian left flank, Russian right flank. But here, generally speaking, the counterattacks were stopped despite certain exchange of territory. Worst situation for Russians is on their left flank or Ukrainian right flank, around the village of Novoprokofivka. From here, before were discussing that Russians were trying to do the flanking attacks, to which then they later shifted to try to attack towards Robotine. But the situation was becoming worse and worse and worse for Russians. Finally, north of Novoprokopivka, there is a quite significant fortification area. It's all dug up. There's a lot of tunnels. There's a lot of very complex trench networks. And Ukrainians were able to breach into those networks and they were able to get Russians out. This is really bad news for the Russians on this direction. So they were forced to essentially relocate additional forces from those flanks that were counterattacking into Robotine to help them establish at least some control back from those fortifications north of Novoprokopivka. They were able to do it for a little bit of a time. That's why sometimes we will see maps change one way or another. However, later on it was fully confirmed that even those counterattacks did not help. And now we hear that all over this place, Russians are being pushed away. So right now we know that Ukrainians have took important positions north of Novoprokofivka. This is also where the high ground is in the area. So Ukrainians not only now control the fortifications north of Novoprokopivka, they are also controlling the high ground. And because Russia utilized their flanks to help reinforce their primary push, now the flanks on their left flank, they are now having really hard time holding on to Ukrainian attacks that are coming their way. So we are hearing that their flanks are also moving up. But despite all of that, what I was saying in my previous video is that this is the main thrust of Ukrainian push. The ultimate goal of Ukraine is to reach Tokmak, not necessarily take it. And Russians know that. And I've been telling a lot that the battle for Tokmak will be bloody and it will be really, really important because Russians understand how important it is. And what we're seeing right now, the battle for Novoprokopivka, it is the battle of Tokmak, because if Russians would be fighting for Tokmak in this area over here, that's already too late. That means Ukraine has pretty much achieved what they wanted. So right now, what is happening here, it is the Battle of Tokmak. It is what decides basically the fate of the southern flank of Russia and southern region of Ukraine that is now controlled of Russia, let's put it this way. And that's why Russians are sending a lot of their reinforcements. We're now hearing that there are additional reinforcements that are taking away from the Velyka Novosilka axis, and now they have been moved back to area around Mariupol. They have been reconstituted with whatever they could, and now they're being sent again to reinforce the Orikhiv direction. That is why in the video, when I said that potentially Ukraine will not achieve in the coming time the goals of their offensive, as Russians still have options where they can pull reserves from, so they can reinforce this penetration point where Ukrainians, despite all of the resistance, despite all of the meat that Russians are throwing their way, Ukrainians are still advancing. And that is the important thing that I wanted to land in a previous video, that while the summer campaign ended, and here I'm starting to tackle some of those comments you made, that while indeed the summer campaign has ended, and I'm going to push back to people that says that no, you cannot arbitrarily define summer campaign or winter campaign. That is unfortunately how Ukraine works, because in between seasons, we saw what Ukraine ground turns into. It turns into mush. It turns into something that doesn't allow for a very particularly good manure. So Ukraine has a limited time of executing this manure. And in my perspective, it was 2 weeks, additionally, until the mid-October, where after which we would potentially start seeing the ground and weather not being completely favorable for Ukrainian side, therefore hindering their offensive capability. So in that sense, what I'm considering a summer campaign is something that is allowed by the weather conditions. Ukraine is continuously pushing. Still, the war is not over. Ukraine, even after the summer campaign, is, despite not achieving the goal, is in a great position. It's really amazing positions for Ukrainians. They are destroying a lot of Russian assets. They are continuously squeezing Russians out, despite they are throwing everything. That's the main direction. So Russians know where Ukrainians are coming, and they still cannot stop them. That is the important thing to realize, that despite all of the best Russian efforts, the only thing that they're doing still so far is slowing Ukraine down for a week, 2 weeks, and so on. But everything they're throwing at it just needs some time. It gets grind down, and they will eventually collapse. And this is what we're seeing happening right now. I was telling you a week ago that Russian positions are becoming really shaky, that their counterattacks are not as fierce, and now we see Ukrainians taking the high ground in the local area and a significant fortified position, which is a win. In a sense of war, it's far from delivering them the winning at the south that we all want, but it's a local win, and every win counts. But important is also to look at the area around Velyka Novosilka, because here the forces that are now being moved, that have been moved back and now going to be sent to Orikhiv direction that I just showed, they were the forces that came in to help with the situation around Priyutne. They were the forces that initially, when Ukrainians started advancing really nicely, when they took Staromayorsk and they started pushing back, there was this threat of collapsing this part of the front line, and that's when those Russian reinforcements were sent in, and they were able to establish to control positions here. And the hope was that they would be able to push from Priyutne up north and reestablish their positions. This did not happen. They were able to regain certain ground here, but nothing that would fully long-term give a favorable ground for Russians to defend. And now these forces, the fighting was still going on in the area. So now these forces have been pulled out and they're being reconstituted and set to the different direction. There are reports that Ukrainians in this area are, I wouldn't say concentrating because I don't want to give away anything, but there are reports here that Ukraine is putting in some groups, whether it's a diversion, because the counter argument to it is that yes, Ukraine might concentrate some forces here, for example, the forces that are trying to recoup and so on, trying to just use this as a base, as a deceiving maneuver, because right now they are already running short of ammunition, and they need to use their ammunition on their most successful axis, which is the Orikhiv axis and around Bakhmut, which is over here and over here. So here it's more about maybe Ukrainians are just trying to do mind games with Russians, and they are concentrating some forces in the area just to make sure that Russians don't send too much troops. But otherwise, it is potential that Ukraine can also utilize later on when Russia accumulate all of their forces on the Rikhiv axis to again enable this offensive. Though again, resources and resource usage have been quite high from Ukrainian side, and it's now completely unclear if they have enough resources, ammunition, and everything else to also push on the Velyka Novosilka axis. I'm pretty sure every one of you noted that we've seen fighting kind of subside from all across the southern front line to be basically on just one direction. Besides that, there are some smaller tactical gains around the area of Vuhledar, but let's see if that's gonna get us anywhere. Other Ukrainian gains are around Andriivka. Here, after losing Klishivka and Andriivka, I explained that Kurdyumivka is a very important stronghold right now in an area. However, this line that they are defending over here, the Russians, and I should use red for Russians, they are defending along the railway. And railway is a big defensive positions for them. And I can now completely state that in the last day, Ukrainians not only were able to move Russians away from railway pretty much everywhere because of their usage of artillery. This is what Russians are reporting. But today, Ukrainian storming forces have entered the area north of Kurdyumivka, in the area of Andriivka, basically somewhere around here. No, I cannot say the precise depth. But Ukrainians have now crossed the railway, they've penetrated its defense line, and they are now establishing themselves. Penetration of a defense line is great. And overall, this paints a very nice picture that we can all agree on, is that Russian defenses in the south are continuing to collapse. Again, how much resources Ukraine is dedicating on this, we don't know, but they're definitely taking it slow. It's this continuous slow grind that can be done even in a less than favorable weather conditions, especially if we can believe what Russia is saying, that the new Ukrainian tactics is basically just burning out everything that Russia is having, every single positions in the front line. And then once Russians have to leave those positions, then they quickly take those positions and then reinforce them and then defend against Russian counterattacks. And talking about Russian counterattacks, there have been reports about it from Western media and Institute for Study of War and other commentators. And they've been making weird assumptions, and a lot of them I will push back on that. I think they don't understand how Russians work, how Russians think, and how Russian military works. Because what they are describing, they're saying, oh, Russians are using this as their tactics. They call it the flexible defense. So they fall back where Ukrainian artillery is strong, and then when artillery stops and Ukrainians retake their positions, then Russians counterattack, and they want to have this defense based on the counterattacks. But it's not how Russians are operating. Anyone that really analyzes from this local communities of Ukrainian or even Russian specific analysts, they're stating that's not the point. That's not how Russia operates. It's not how Russian officers operate. Russian officers, they have the responsibility for the parts of the front line. And for them, losing territory is unacceptable. You can lose as many men as you want, but losing territory is unacceptable. So when the troops just cannot hold the territory physically, then they run away, then they fall back, because none of the Russians are leaving this. And the most important thing, that they're then back pushed into the battle to retake those positions, because losing of territory is unacceptable. It is not done because of this is the flexible defense. This is done because there is a PR problem, that you cannot report bad news, because that's not how Russian command works. And that's very, very relevant for us all to hopefully also delivered to the Western analysts, that Russian military operates more on the simpler terms rather than having this hive mind complex structure of newly defense tactics. That's like the simpler solution here is the right one. It's just because they are either afraid from their command or they just want to have a PR victory. And to slowly wrap this all up, I want to acknowledge a comment that someone said about the weather conditions on the southern front line. People very fairly noted that the summer around Zaporizhia and the southern regions is a lot warmer and less susceptible to bad weather. So potentially the 2 weeks that I said for Ukrainian summer offensive is relevant for areas such as Bakhmut, but in the south, potentially Ukrainian momentum and possibilities for maneuver warfare are longer than these 2 weeks. So I acknowledge that this is indeed a possibility. The 2 weeks in the middle of October is an arbitrary condition that I've put on evaluation of the offensive. So there we go. And another trend that I really want to show, and here I'm going to break my own rules and I'm actually going to show the source. This is from a Twitter user by the handle HairDR8. And the problem that I have with showing sources always is because people start arguing about numbers, the source, where is it coming from, is it trustworthy? And I really hate that because it's usually me that's doing the analysis. But I think it's very important for us all to just visually see the point that I'm making, as just seeing the charts is what really gets you to the understanding. So what do we see here? Well, this chart shows Russian artillery shells usage and Russian artillery shell availability. Over here, we find out that Russia started with around 20 million shells. And during the first year of war, they've used over 11 million shells, which we can see here. And I'm going to move this a little bit out of the way. And over the 2023, they used additional 5.8 million shells. Their production has since then increased from 1 million shells in 2022 to about 1.5 million shells in 2023. So right now, Russia is netting about 0.7 million shells total for the 2023. This brings us neatly to what's Ukrainian usage, and we see that Ukrainian usage is very fast approaching the 10,000 mark, whereas the Russian shell usage is dropping like off the cliff. And their production that they've decided to increase up to 2 million of shells is not nearly enough. And what this user very nicely estimates is he explains that by Q4 2023, by the third quarter, Ukraine will actually overtake Russia in number of shells fired per month, which is just ludicrous when you consider that this is the artillery war. This is both Russian shell shortage plus Russian artillery being decimated. All in all, I want you to look at these trends and understand that Ukraine is starting to win the artillery war. They're already there. We were talking about the tipping point. This is what is showing this tipping point. You can argue about the numbers. Numbers can be argued. Russia might still fire more shells than Ukraine. The point is the trend is there, and the trend shows it very, very clearly. Russia is screwed beyond belief. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. Thank you so much to all of the moderators. Please support Ukrainian armed forces. Check out the link in the description or the first comment. We're trying to get a track to Ukrainian armed forces. You can also get an amazing patch for it. It's really nice. Support the channel if you can. Slava Ukraini. I love you all, and I'll see you guys next time.